Okay, this set of videos is going to be entitled the 1920s, and it's going to be a set of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 short videos, and it's going to kind of encapsulate all the 1920s. Now, I want you to have these done by Wednesday on 1/14, okay? So that's January 14th. So you're going to have a little bit of time to get them done, but we're going to have a quiz next week, so I want you to have all this information. Now, so the 1920s, why it matters. The 1920s, an era of rapid change, clashing values. Many Americans believed society was losing its traditional values, and they took action to preserve these values. Other Americans, they embraced new values associated with a freer lifestyle, which we've talked about, women, the flappers a little bit, and the pursuit of individual goals. Writers and artists pursued distinctly American themes, and you have the Harlem Renaissance, which gave African Americans new pride. Okay? All right, so the impact today. The 1920s left a permanent legacies for our American culture. National celebrities in sports and film emerged. You have jazz music became part of American culture. And you have two American writers, Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway, wrote classics of American literature. Okay, one of the things we've talked about already is a resurgence of nativism. In the 1920s, racism and nativism increased. You have immigrants and a demobilized military men and women competing for the same jobs during a time of high unemployment and increased cost of living. Okay, so you have ethnic prejudice was the basis of the Sacco and Vanzetti case, in which two immigrant men were accused of murder and theft. They were thought to be anarchists, or they opposed to all forms of government. Sacco and Vanzetti were sentenced to death, and in 1927 they were executed, still proclaiming their innocence. Nativists used the ideas of eugenics, which is the false science of the improvement of hereditary traits, to give support to their arguments against immigration. Nativists emphasized that human equalities were inherited and said that inferior people should not be allowed to breed. This added to the anti-immigrant feeling of the time and further promoted the idea of strict immigrant control. You have a resurgence in the KKK, which they led a movement to restrict immigration. The new Klan not only targeted the freed African Americans, but also Catholics, Jews, immigrants, and other groups who they believed to have un-American values, in which we've read about these in class already a little bit, so you should kind of have an understanding of that. Because of publicity campaign, by 1924, the KKK had over 4 million members and stretched beyond the South into northern cities. Scandals and poor leadership led to a decline of the Klan in the late 1920s. The Depression might have had a little bit to do with that as well. Politicians supported by the Klan were eventually voted out of office. Okay, so one of the things in the 1920s they wanted to do was to control immigration. So in 1921, President Harding signed the Immigration Quota Act, limiting immigration to 3% of the total number of people in any ethnic group already living in the United States. This discriminated heavily against Southern and Eastern Europeans. The National Origins Act in 1924 made immigrant restriction a permanent policy. The act lowered the quotas to 2% of each national group living in the U.S. in 1890. This further restricted immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. The act exempted immigrants from the Western Hemisphere from the quotas, though. The Immigration Acts of 1921 and 1924 further reduced the labor pool in the United States. Employers needed laborers for agricultural, mining, and railroad work. So you had Mexican immigrants begin pouring into the United States between 1914 and the end of the 1920s. The immigrants fled their country in the aftermath of were leaving the country in the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution of 1910. Okay, also in the United States in the 1920s, you get a new morality which is being established. It challenged the traditional ideas and glorified youth and personal freedom. Oh, you guys love this one. New ideas about marriage, work, and pleasure affected the way people lived. Women broke away from families as they entered the workforce, and they earned their own livings, or they attended college. The automobile gave American youth the opportunity to pursue interests away from their parents. And women's fashions were drastically changed in the 1920s. You had the advent of the flapper, a young, dramatic, stylish, and unconventional woman exemplified the change in women's behavior. You know, they were smoking, drinking, wearing clothes that were showing off their legs, things like that. And then professionally, women made advances in the fields of science, medicine, law, and literature. Okay, you have the fundamentalist movement. Some Americans feared the new morality and worried about America's social decline. Many of these people came from small rural towns and joined a religious movement called fundamentalism. The fundamentalists rejected Darwin's theory of evolution, which suggested that humans developed from lower forms of life over millions of years. Instead, fundamentalists believed in creationism, that God created the world as described in the Bible. In 1925, Tennessee passed the Butler Act, which made it illegal to teach anything that denied creationism and taught evolution instead. The debate between evolutionists and creationists came to a head with the Scopes monkey trial. Or it was called the Scopes trial, and people call it the Scopes monkey because of the monkey of evolution, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Answering the request of the ACLU, John T. Scopes, a biology teacher, volunteered to test the Butler Act by teaching evolution in his class. After being arrested and put on trial, Scopes was found guilty, but the case was later overturned. After the trial, many fundamentalists withdrew from political activism. All right, and finally in the 1920s, also with this, keeping with our theme of a clash of values, Prohibition was passed. Many people felt that the passage of the 18th Amendment, which prohibited alcohol, would reduce unemployment, domestic violence, and poverty. They saw alcohol as the root of many evils. Okay, the Volstead Act made the enforcement of prohibition the responsibility of the U.S. Treasury Department. Until the 1900s, police powers, the government's power to control people and property in the public's interest, had been the job of state governments. Okay, so see a little bit of government encroachment on police power. Many Americans ignored the laws of prohibition. They went to secret bars called speakeasies where alcohol could be purchased. Crime became big business, and gangsters corrupted many local politicians and governments. In 1933, the ratification of the 21st Amendment ended Prohibition. It was a defeat for supporters of traditional values and those who favored the use of federal police powers to achieve moral reform. That concludes our video for this one on A Clash of Values. You will have a few other videos who will come who will come later on. I'll work on getting those done here really quickly. All right, enjoy and have fun. Have a great weekend.